So we talked about finding regulations. So what were some of the ways we talked about that we can find administrative regulations? GovInfo is one of the sources, but how do we identify which regulations it is we want to find? At GovInfo or Lexis or Westlaw or Bloomberg. In other words, how do we research and say,
if you know an applicable statute in the area, you could go to the statute and then it gives you references to citing references or cases of decisions.
So, citing references, absolutely. Or context, sometimes you'll find the CFR links in the context and analysis. I've got a regulation up here now, so we won't see the references. But either one of these links. What else? So your best friend annotated code, number 1. What else? Standard ways we've been talking about. Let's just review. Secondary sources, yeah. Encyclopedias, treatises, wherever you might get it. Index, another good source, yeah. One more, which is usually the first place most folks want to go.
Google?
Google, keyword search, whether it's Google, Lexis, Westlaw. Google isn't bad to start. Okay. So once there, and you find a particular regulation, and however it is you do so, what's the one thing you want to remember to look at? We've talked about this as a strategy we've used throughout in the resources, but it's especially important with regard to regulations. Table of contents, absolutely. So you find one particular relevant regulation. So I think this particular section was one of the ones we might have found referenced in our annotated code from section 1132. So we want to work our way up the table of contents to where it's no longer relevant. So we probably stop here at chapter 25. And here's what it looks like on Westlaw, ditto on Lexis, just working your way back. Maybe you want to expand the entire table of contents because remember, for our particular client, there's more than one part. Remember, the part is sort of the subject area, and then we have the actual section number. So we may want to expand our way to look at the full table of contents, or you can work your way up either way. So you can see the different parts. So we were just looking at part 25. I'm sorry, 2560. Looking here, 2570 might be useful, as well as some of these parts. The definition part might be useful. So again, the table of contents really being critical when you're looking at regulations. I would always look at the table of contents. You won't always find additional sections, but it's always worthwhile to check. Okay, and back here at our section, we talked about the usefulness of, here on Westlaw, it's called credits, the source. So where in the Federal Register did our regulation come from? We might need to trace that back if we want to look at the regulatory history, why the agency promulgated these rules in the first place. We looked through the Federal Register, we saw all the background information, and of course the authority, like we just saw with John Stewart and John Oliver. What statutory authority, where was the statutory authority for the agency to promulgate the regulations? And as we talked about last week, we talked about instances in which people sued the agency because they felt that the agency exceeded its statutory authority in promulgating those regulations. Or on the other side of the flip side of the coin, agencies have been sued for not promulgating regulations that Congress told them to do, so they are legally required to promulgate those regulations. So it can go either way. But again, that statutory authority is very important, and you will see that here on Westlaw in the credits. And Lexis, let's just go back to a section here. Lexis calls the source the history, and again, it gives us the authority. Okay, just a quick review because a few people were a little bit confused last time, and so was I, quite honestly. We talked about the importance of updating, because updating, of course, is always very important. And, of course, on Lexis and Westlaw, make it very easy for us. It lets us know pretty much at the top how up-to-date the resource is. But if we want to check the most up-to-date changes for our regulation, anybody remember the free government site to do that? On GovInfo, absolutely. You're getting warm, as they like to say.
When you pull it up, doesn't it? It shows you.
Well, on Lexis and Westlaw, so
No,
for...
if you pull it up on gov.info, it'll say like current through January or April or.
Well, on GovInfo, you need to be careful. So here... So under... So remember, the eCFR, remember, if you Google eCFR, you wind up at this funky other site that I don't even know who's responsible for it. But to go back to what you were saying, Tessa, remember the print CFR is only updated every year. Now, different parts of it are updated different months during the year, so that's what this explanation is. And remember, there are different colors depending on what month it's updated. So some are in January, some are in April, I think July and October, or April, yeah, April, July, and October, whatever. But that's what you will see in this Code of Federal Regulations annual edition on GovInfo. So you'll only see as of basically the print was updated. You want to remember the eCFR and be very careful when you're Googling to go to the ecfr.gov. And it's a little tricky to find, as I discovered with you last week. So I found that once you're in the CFR here, you can scroll down and get the link at the related resources. You can also Google, but be very careful again that you wind up on a .gov site and not a .io site, which is the first link, at least last week, that we got when we Googled eCFR. So that's going way back to first class and bibliographic awareness and critically evaluating what a website is and wondering, why is that .io? Okay. And the last part of administrative materials that we talked about were administrative decisions. Question?
Yeah, one question. So when you ask us, hypothetically, if you ask us on assignment 5, when is this under GovInfo last updated, you don't want the 4 time a year, month, and day. You want the actual date through eCFR?
Well, read the question. I don't know which question you're referring to, so I should ask you when a particular resource.
Yeah.
So if it's Lexis or Westlaw, you want to look at where Lexis and Westlaw listed. If I ask you where is a free site to update the CFR, then I'm looking for the eCFR.
Thank you.
And if you're not sure what I'm asking, let me know. Other questions? Okay, so oh yeah.
When I click on that, it actually doesn't work.
Oh, botheration. You gotta love that. So for now, I would say here we have, and I meant to mention this in the beginning, so thank you for the reminder. Again, on our course website, you will find a link, and this one should work. This one does work. I will find a reliable link, because I know once you graduate, you won't be going to the course website anymore. I will find a reliable way for you to get there. Government web isn't giving me the right link. We will find a good way to do it. But I'm going to write myself a note. Good link. Okay. Other questions? All good ones. So again, we talked about regulations, the actual law that's promulgated by statutory authority by the agencies. Agencies also issue what is called quasi-judicial decisions. There are administrative law judges that sit in the agencies and will adjudicate particular disputes. Finding those decisions can be on the trickier side. So here on Westlaw, our favorite search, liability HMO, you can get directly to administrative decisions and guidance. Remember, regulations will be under a different link here, topic or source type. Lexis is a little bit trickier. And this is true whatever the jurisdiction. So I haven't limited jurisdiction. It's true for federal administrative decisions and regulations as well as state. Here on Lexis, notice we have just the general administrative materials. That's where you'll find the decisions. Again, because I haven't limited by jurisdiction, it'll be federal and state. And then to find the actual regulations when you've done a keyword search, you want to remember to go to Administrative Codes and Regulations. But then to look at the administrative code, so to look at the CFR or to look at your state's code of regulations, you want to limit or further filter down to administrative codes. I don't know why Lexis does that, but you want to see if you can remember, especially those of you who are either prefer Lexis or know that you're going to wind up working in a place that uses only Lexis. Okay, I'm not a fan of looking for administrative decisions on Lexis or Westlaw because I find it's very hit or miss in terms of which agencies, both state or federal, that they have available online. So at least for federal, I prefer this University of Virginia Administrative Decisions Research Guide. So if you can remember Research Guide Administrative Decisions on Google, you're likely to get here. GovInfo actually does have some administrative decisions, but it's actually also rather hit or miss in my experience. And that's the eCFR we couldn't find. Okay. Any questions about federal? I was just meant as a quick review to set the stage for when we talk about state administrative sources. But before we move to state, there's one other aspect of federal administrative materials that we should discuss, and that is presidential materials, which I think is particularly interesting these days because it's in the news a whole lot. So also on GovInfo, and actually I think this is probably the best place to find presidential documents if that's what you are interested in. And here on GovInfo, to get to the compilation of presidential documents, if you're lucky, they have it under a link under presidential documents. If you know the name of the source, you can go A to Z. I find on GovInfo the best way to find just about anything is either that A to Z list or the category list. And then you have to look a little bit, but you can figure out presidential materials are going to be there. And then the publication itself is called Compilation of Presidential Documents. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as weekly compilation. That was back before web days. Now it's referred to as daily compilation or just compilation. So don't get confused if you see a time frame in there. It's the same thing. So anybody remember the type of presidential document we've already talked about? Signing statements. So there are numbers of different places you can find it, obviously Google, but so here in the compilation, did that work? Yes, that worked. So here is January from 2018. I just randomly picked that month only because it has a decent selection. And I'm just searching for Bill to get there quickly. So here you see a presidential remarks on signing legislation to combat international narcotics trafficking. So this is the president's signing statement for that particular public law. These days, however, where presidential documents have become more interesting, have to do with other types of presidential documents. So have any of you been reading about the DACA discussions in Congress and elsewhere? Ring a bell? So a lot of that revolved around what the president did and said regarding the DACA program, and those are essentially presidential materials. So if you were interested in the DACA issue, you might remember that back in the latter half of last year, So here is the president's statement regarding the DACA program. And so here's essentially where the president made his statement indicating his intent to basically terminate that program. Because this is statements of the president as well as signing statements, just regular old speaking statements, because of that the DACA program was administered through the Department of Justice. It was actually officially announced through the Department of Justice, so you can see it spelled out here. So these are statements that have profound effect on those folks who are involved in the DACA program, and this is where you would find them. And as you can see, what's going on with this particular program continues to be an issue as of even just a couple of weeks ago. So this, as we saw with some of the other examples we talked about with the EPA, these executive documents also involve other branches of government. So what's been going on with the DACA program is, of course, is also in the courts. So you can see this very recent New York Times article talking about what's going on with DACA in the courts. So again, just to show you, this is real world stuff. It's not just hypotheticals, and the involvement of the different branches with regard to how these programs are administered and run. Okay, another type of executive document is an executive order. And we heard a lot about executive orders last year when there were executive orders issued regarding who may and may not come into this country as visitors, as immigrants, and the various visa programs. So another source we're looking at now is whitehouse.gov. This is another site you need to be very careful about because there are a lot of spoofs on it, whitehouse.com, and there are probably a lot of other domains that use that. So that's not the official source. This is, of course, because this is a White House source. It's going to present to you the view of issues that the White House wants to present. So to take a look at executive orders, we could find them on where we just were looking on GovInfo. This is another source that's a little more up to date, actually, than GovInfo, the whitehouse.gov. So we find the presidential actions, basically, make sure I get this right. And it's interesting, as I go over this each year, as different presidents are in office, they totally change the website. So you just have to get used to that when there's a new president, this website's going to be totally different. So how to get to these can be very different. So this year, or under this administration, we now go to news and presidential actions, and that was the page we were looking at. And sure enough, if you go down, eventually you will find So you'll see the different types of documents. So there's nominations, there's memoranda, proclamations. Proclamations are typically, although not always, less substantive issues. So here you can see this proclamation declaring April 8th through 14th as National Crime Victims' Rights Week. So I guess we're in the midst of National Crime Victims' Rights Week this week. So proclamations deal with that sort of issue. Tends to be less, pardon me?
Also equal pay day.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So eventually, if we were to scroll through, we would find an executive order. You can also do, I find actually, if I can't find it easily, remember our site search in Google, SITE : I put that in front here, and then I search for executive orders. Or what I've done is I've just pulled one up. I did exactly that and just pulled one up. So here is that executive order that, again, was in the news a lot and fairly controversial back from last year, indicating who and who may not be allowed in the country. Executive orders have been in the news quite a lot, not just since 2017, but President Obama used them extensively, and they were occasionally controversial as well. So executive orders can establish rights. I mean, think about it. The folks who are affected by this executive order has significantly affected people's rights. So it may be that you need to determine whether or not an executive order is still in effect. So President Obama issued a whole lot of them. Now that he's no longer president, though, which of President Obama's executive orders are still in effect or not? Likewise, even President Trump's, because some have been rescinded. So here on federalregister.gov, we went to this site last week. You can also find executive orders. If you go here to the browse menu, you can get directly to this page, and you see them basically listed by president. And the neat thing about this Federal Register site is it used to be really complicated to figure out whether an executive order was still in effect or not. There are some executive orders from presidents before you were all born, before I was born, that are still in effect. I think it was President Eisenhower who integrated the military. That executive order obviously is still in effect. So they do make substantive differences in people's lives. So here you can see the executive orders from President Trump from 2017, and what you'll notice is this list of executive orders. This is essentially a disposition table, again, federalregister.gov, and you'll notice that this one supersedes an earlier one from 2016. So that was when President Obama was still in office. And at least online, this table goes back to President Clinton. Did I see a question somewhere? And here's what an executive order looks like. So this is the executive order regarding entry into the country that from last March, a year ago March, that we looked at. It gives you notes in terms of other executive orders that were either affected by this one or later on affected. So this was issued in March 2017, so this one affected this January one and apparently was affected by this October one. And here are the executive orders again from President Obama. As I mentioned, you can see the status. So I can see this particular executive order was revoked last year, not by a different one. And again, that tends to happen. If we look through President Obama's, we'll see that he revoked executive orders from President Bush. And that's just what happens because that's how politics work. Any questions about executive orders or other presidential materials? So you, in addition to the compilation of presidential documents to these places online, the official place to find executive documents, both executive orders, proclamations, will be Title III of the CFR. If we go back to GovInfo, we would see that Title III is presidential materials. And you will also find, no, I'm in, that's not where I wanted to be. You will also find presidential materials in the Federal Register. So just as final regulations start in the Federal Register and then get codified into the Code of Federal Regulations, presidential materials, at least executive orders and executive proclamations. Oh, see, it skips over Title III. Let's go to 2017. See, the president. A whole lot of clicking just to show you Title III is the president, but okay. So again, Title III and the CFR also appear in the Federal Register, and those are the official sources. Questions on executive materials? Okay, let's then talk about state administrative resources. The thing about state administrative resources is you already know most of it already because it works pretty much the same as federal administrative resources. They haven't even really changed the names a whole lot. A little bit, depends on the state. So here in our sources chart, we see executive administrative materials and regulations. So sure enough, the chronological publication, not surprisingly, we have the Federal Register under federal, so under state, it's called the New York State Register. Surprise, surprise. The subject compilation is the Code of Federal Regulations under federal, slightly different name under New York. The official compilation of the codes, rules, and regulations of the state of New York. No one's going to ever expect you to remember that. It's referred to, however, as the NYCRR. And the one thing you want to be careful about is that a lot of people, attorneys included, I hate to say, get that confused with the New York City Code. And we'll be talking about municipal codes a little later today. Because NYC sounds like New York City, right? New York City rules and regulations. That makes total sense. And I could totally understand why people get confused, but it's still not right. So NYCRR is the New York State Regulations. So think of this as the New York Code, rules and regulations. And again, it's the administrative code for the entire state of New York, not just the city. And we'll talk about New York City for a little while in a little bit. Okay. And pretty much we find New York regulations, other states' regulations, the same way that we do for federal regulations. So we can do keyword search, all of the methods that we've already talked about. Here's an example, one particular example. I pulled this up only because this was actually a reference question I had, which was kind of interesting. But it's also a nice example of just how specific regulations can get. And this is true of federal regulations also. This has to do with equine drug thresholds. So that's how specific. And they are giving us actual numbers of actual drugs that I can't even pronounce. That's how specific it is. And the particular interesting aspect of this reference question, which I won't go into a whole lot of detail, is this is an attorney. So again, this is real world practice. An attorney came and he was trying to figure out what regulation applied to his client in September of 2014. And what we had to do is go through the credits to figure out. Remember, we all spoke through for the statutes, we looked at the public laws and we said semicolon and amended by. Well, the same thing works for regulations, and so we had to work through this entire statement to figure out what section applied in September of 2014, because that was when he received a particular citation or summons from an agency that he was fighting for his client. So this stuff does have real-world applicability as practicing attorneys. Okay, we already talked about finding regulations, state regulations, because again, it works the same way. For regulations, we just limit to whatever jurisdiction. We're all familiar with that, and make sure to take a look at regulations, or if we were interested in administrative decisions. Likewise on Lexis, just want to remember to filter to administrative codes. One thing you want to remember about New York regulations, I don't know if this is true in other states, but it would work the same. If you see these references, it would work the same way. And by these references, I mean, so we already talked about that. Darn it, where did that go? There we go. So occasionally in the New York regulations, so in the state, in the NYCRR, you will see a reference to see the building code or see the fire code. These are separate publications, separate codes that for whatever reason New York has decided to publish and promulgate separately. Again, Google's our friend, and you can find them fairly easily just by Googling, and you will see where you'll find them is this particular site, this iccsafe.org, that basically deals in publishing these very specialized codes. And I expect that they're separate because they are so specialized in terms of requirements for making buildings safe, and fire safety can get very technical and specialized. So you can see that this International Building Code as adopted by New York State. And you also see different dates. So as always, need to update, and be bibliographically aware to read carefully to find the most up-to-date code if that's what you need. These used to be really, really difficult to find, but now that they're available on the web, it's made that type of research a whole lot easier. So again, with regard to state, works pretty much the same way. So with regard to administrative agencies, in terms of searching and using our filters on Lexis and Westlaw, in terms of finding state administrative regulations and codes for free, it's pretty much state specific. So for New York, if you were to do a Google search for NYCRR, I'm pretty sure it would lead you to this link, or it would lead you to the unofficial NYCRR, because the government of New York doesn't publish the official, at least not online, and what the unofficial NYCRR online actually is our friends at Westlaw, but this is available to anybody. You don't have to have a Westlaw account. So as you can see, it looks a whole lot different than Westlaw and doesn't have all of the nice features and filters and ability to key cite that Westlaw has, but it does have the text of the regulations. So that is at least something. In terms of finding agency decisions, that starts to get tricky. As I said, they are available in Lexis and Westlaw through the usual ways we've just looked at, but very hit or miss in terms of which agencies and which agencies' publications. You can try to find them online. So here's the New York State website, the official government website. You can see ny.gov. If we go here to government, actually go back up to the top here at government, and as we scroll down, you will see eventually there's a listing of the agencies. So you might want to go, if you're looking for administrative decisions, typically you probably would be looking for a particular agency's decisions. So if we, for our client, if we were limit to health, we could go to the Department of Health. Then within the Department of Health, and each agency is going to look different. Each agency designs its own website. So here within the Department of Health, we might want to look at laws and regulations. Again, there's not really a great reason to go this way rather than the online, the free Westlaw site. Obviously, if you have Lexis or Westlaw available and don't have to worry about costs, that would be an even better way to go. And under that, in that link we just looked at, the laws and regulations, that's what it looks like here. Couple of reasons you might want to go here. As I said, looking at the regulations, you could do that at the free Westlaw site, you could do that at regular Westlaw or Lexis, but there's something called a regulatory agenda, and that can be useful to determine if you're doing a lot of work with a particular state regulation. And these regulatory agendas exist for federal agencies as well, and I'm guessing for other than New York State, other states' agencies. You can get a sense of what that agency is considering. So if this is an area you practice in, you probably want to be looking at the regulatory agenda with some regularity. So in trying to find administrative decisions, I think probably the web is going to be about the best place. So here, let's actually go here. You can see I looked for New York State administrative decisions, and a couple of different links come up. This is more of a general information about hearings. So you can see there's actually an Office of Administrative Hearings. Who knew? And you can do a decision search. And this probably gives you guidelines about about the different processes and procedures for New York State administrative hearings. And again, this is the other link, a more informational site. And again, this was just a Google search. If you have a particular department in mind, you can Google that as well. As I said, finding administrative decisions on the federal, for federal agencies is hard enough. It's even more difficult for state. Really, I think Google is probably the best way to go. And last but not least, we have guidelines. Remember, there's the decisions, the actual judicial adjudication or administrative judge judicial adjudication. There are also guidance that can be so useful. We kind of came, as we said with the federal, we came full circle because we were looking at guidance way back when we first talked about secondary sources, when we found some Department of Labor guidance on the web. The same can be true for New York. And sometimes these guidelines can be really, really useful from a day-to-day practice standpoint. And again, you can find them, try to find them in the particular agency's website, or actually, as you can see, a Google search is pretty useful. And you can see the guidance documents for the Department of Health, since that's what I looked for. And again, you could do a site search. Remember that technique? Any questions about state? I know we went kind of quickly through state administrative materials, but like I said, it's pretty much wash, rinse, repeat, as they like to say. Okay, municipal. I've been referring to municipal throughout. So same concepts really apply, and I think most folks don't think about this, but within a municipality, you will have the document that establishes a municipal government. A large municipality like New York City, or a not quite as large municipality like Nassau County or the town of Hempstead. And The document that establishes a government typically is the charter for that municipality. So the New York City Charter establishes the structure of the New York City government, and likewise other municipalities. So charter is kind of analogous to a constitution. So the concepts are the same, the names are just a little bit different. Likewise, for statutes, they're frequently referred to as local laws. They are kind of local for a particular municipality. And again, understanding the names can be really useful. If you're looking at a municipality's website and you know you want to find a particular law from a particular year, you see the link to local laws, that's likely where you'll find it. Now so that's the equivalent of session laws or chapter laws in New York. So again, law enacted by the legislature, organized chronologically. So a local law is enacted by a municipality's legislature, sometimes a town or city council. Now these local laws, just like our session laws, get codified, and this is where it starts to get, the naming starts to get a little bit confusing. So of course we have the code. We have the United States Code that we've talked a whole lot about. We have the state code here in New York, often just referred to as McKinney's, even though that's just one version of it. In municipalities, the statutes that are codified, that are put in subject arrangement, are referred to as administrative codes. Now, we refer to regulations on the state and federal side as administrative codes, so it can be really confusing that municipalities refer to their legislative codes as administrative codes. Don't really have a great way to keep track of it other than to sort of keep in mind that municipalities just name things weird. And then there are a very few very large municipalities, not too many, that do actually have agencies, municipal agencies that issue regulations. New York City is an example that issues rules, that kind of sounds the same as federal and state, that New York City agencies actually issue these rules, and they're usually referred to as rules of the particular municipality. So at the risk of sounding repetitive, where do we find all this stuff? Once again, online with our good old friend Google. There are a couple of sites I'll show you in a little while that you can go to, but honestly, just Googling it is easier. So you want to find the Town of Hempstead website. We are currently in the Town of Hempstead. I should mention, by the way, municipal law can get really, here in New York, can get extraordinarily complex because they're overlapping jurisdictions. The reason we're all interested, well, not the only reason, but one huge reason we're all interested in municipal law is because municipal law is what governs our day-to-day existence. Snow plowing, hopefully we're done with that. Parking, trash pickup, all that stuff that just, you know, is our day-to-day existence. But here in New York, for whatever reason, we have overlapping jurisdictions. So we are now currently sitting in the Town of Hempstead, that's also in the County of Nassau. And those are overlapping jurisdictions that both of which municipalities can affect our existence. As I've mentioned before, I live in the city of Long Beach. That is not the Town of Hempstead. So I'm not affected in the city of Long Beach by the Town of Hempstead, but I am affected by the County of Nassau municipal law. Now, by the way, I stopped myself there because municipal law is also often referred to as ordinances. And that might be one way to remember to try to Google when you're looking for a particular municipality's codes. So the way to do that, I think, because you're typically looking for a particular municipality, is Google a municipality. You might just Google ordinance or code, or you might navigate around to give you a sense of, again, why we care. Here in the Town of Hempstead, you take a look at what they have available. So there's the highway department, there's traffic control, public safety, water, emergency services, all sanitation. All these things affect our day-to-day existence. So there are, and the town government acts on all of these areas that affect our daily lives. You can see here buildings. So for those of you who will be working in the real estate area, we have a Town of Hempstead Building Department, and there is a building zone ordinance. Again, remember that term ordinance is really another word for code. To find so that's where you find the building code. Again, remember building codes are very specialized, so they can be published separately. To find the town code for the Town of Hempstead, turns out it's under the town board link. You may or may not guess that. Again, if you Google it, you'd probably find it easily enough. And here's the Town of Hempstead General Code. And more of these codes, municipal codes all over the country, are available for free online. And here you can get a sense of what they look like. So if I were to search I'm sure your favorite topic, parking, we can see what the Town of Hempstead has to say about parking and night parking. So here are the particular sections. And same strategies apply. I would look at the section. I would look at the table of contents. This is a statutory code, just like the state and federal codes we were looking at. This just applies to the folks, those of us here in the Town of Hempstead. And as I mentioned, we're also in the County of Nassau. So again, Googling Nassau County looks totally different. If you were trying to browse your way through, frequently what you are looking for is going to be under a government link. We actually saw that with New York State as well. We see the link to the county legislature. Somewhere in here there's a link to laws, regulations, and codes. So here's that link. And again, the Nassau County Administrative Code. Don't get confused by the name. Administrative Code is actually those ordinances, that subject arrangement of the code, of the legislation issued by the Nassau County Legislature. The charter is, again, what establishes the government. And here we'll see, here's the link for the county legislature. And the local laws, again, are like the session laws. So here for 2018, just, again, chronological. So we have our date, 2018, local law number 1. The first one passed in 2018 to authorize the county executive to settle and compromise possible claims. In relation to real property tax exemption. So again, just daily stuff that affects living in a particular jurisdiction, in a particular town. If for whatever reason Googling didn't work for you, there are a couple of sites that gather these codes. What I've done here on the course website is under the class web links. Actually, let's go back here. So here under class web links, you see a folder for municipal law. And within that folder, there are a couple of sites, Municode and General Code, that gather these different municipal codes. Not sure that this is particularly important to remember because, again, Googling works just fine typically. If for whatever reason you needed a little more background on the complexity of New York municipal law, as I mentioned with all the overlapping jurisdictions, believe it or not, I'm going to recommend this Wikipedia site. I wouldn't cite to it, of course, because it's not a good idea to cite to Wikipedia, but certainly to educate myself and get some background, this is actually a really good site. And this would lead you another way to get background on the particular local law structure of New York, or this probably would work for other states as well, is the actual state website when they talk about local government. Local government is the term usually used for municipalities. And so New York has a whole department of local government services, how to adopt local laws. So here's sort of the general rules within New York for municipalities, and New York actually also has a local government handbook. if you are involved in municipal issues or you wind up practicing in municipal law, it is absolutely imperative that you read the newspaper, and read the local newspaper, because that's where you will find out what's going on, and obviously whatever format you prefer. Any questions? Okay, so let's do a workshop to put all this together. Keep a copy for myself. Actually, so I'm first passing around today's workshop, and I will also, I'll start it on the other side. It's going to take a little while to go through. These are workshops for last week's, because for those of you who are here, I'm afraid this isn't in the greatest of order.
Thank you.
You'll have to go through, but you'll be starting today's workshop with a question from last week's. I figured out how to get a reliable link to the ECFR. And the trick is to remember that ECFR stands for Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. And here on GovInfo, you go to the A to Z and go to E. The Electronic Code of Federal Regulations link actually works. I can remember I'm going to report to them that that other link, which also should work, needs to be fixed. So thank you, Amy, for pointing that out, and hopefully that will be a reliable link until they fix the other ones. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we have now finished up primary sources. We've looked at the 3 different branches, and now that we have a sense of what all of the materials are, we're going to take a look at some sources that bring everything we've discussed thus far, so all of the 3 types of primary sources as well as secondary sources all together. So in a sense, we are coming back full circle to talk once again about secondary sources. And actually some of the things we're going to look at now we've seen before. But hopefully now we can appreciate them a little bit better, having a sense of what we need to look for with regard to primary sources. So back in the day, I used to refer to these sources as loose leaves. And I wasn't the only one. These sources used to be referred to as loose leaves because, well, they were loose leaves. They were, the binders take pages out, and as you can see, they still exist. This is still a current loose leaf. And the advantage to these, back in when everything was in print, is that because it's loose leaf, you could get pages and pull out just a single page and replace it. So they were able to be updated more than annually the way pocket parts are updated. They could be updated every month. And for the titles that we still get in print in a library, we still receive little packets of pages, and we have staff that goes through and files these. And I imagine some of you will encounter them wherever you wind up practicing. However, much of these are now available online. There are a lot of advantages that we already know about. There are actually a few disadvantages, and as we look at them online, the online publications still have some of the features of the print that actually can be a little bit confusing online or sometimes really helpful. So the first type of all-inclusive resource, and I refer to these as practice materials because most of these are designed for practitioners. They're typically not used for scholarly types of research. So law professors are going to be using these less frequently, but attorneys who practice use these all of the time. And as I said, we've seen a whole bunch of these already. So If we go back to our favorite search, liability HMO, as you may recall, in looking in secondary sources, and again, these practice materials, these all-inclusive practice materials, are secondary sources, but they have a lot of primary sources as well. And here on Westlaw, I will narrow our publication type to texts and treatises. And what you may remember way back when is, and some of you identified this as we did our secondary source workshop, is this liability of health maintenance organizations from American jurisprudence proof of facts. So again, this isn't the regular AmJur encyclopedia that's very basic and just gives us an introduction. This is more of what I'm going to call encyclopedic practice materials. Don't worry if you don't remember that term. I think I'm the only one who's ever used it, so you'll probably never hear it again, but it was just helped me think about how to describe what these are. So AmJur, of course, is encyclopedia, but this is a very specialized AmJur for practice purposes, for proof of facts, and you can kind of think about what AmJur proof of facts does by its title. And as we looked at proof of facts, we looked at the table of contents way back when, and we got the overview of managed care and health maintenance organizations. But what we didn't look quite as closely at, because we were focused on just getting to know the subject, is some of the other practice-oriented type sections. So, I mean, we saw some of these explanations, and again, this goes into far more depth than an encyclopedia. So here's a preemption of negligence claims, eligibility versus treatment claims. So again, that could be useful, but so again, we have the secondary source aspect of explanation. It's referring us to ERISA, so it's going to refer us to the primary sources, and again, it would have the links. That's one of the advantages of online, is you don't have to go track down the primary sources. We even have some theories here. And here we have some discussion of damages, and you can see some of the practice type resources that we haven't really talked about, we didn't talk about rather when we talked about secondary sources. So here's an elements of damages, a checklist. If you're practicing from a day-to-day standpoint, get very excited when you see a checklist. It's just going to make your life a whole lot easier, because it's what it sounds like. It's going to give you a list of what you want to think about, what you want to be looking for, what you want to not forget to put in a document, what you want to remember to put in a document. So again, pulling together this proof of facts, pulling together all of the different elements that we've talked about in terms of primary sources. As I mentioned in the explanation overview of ERISA, we get a link, obviously either in the footnote or in the text, to the relevant statutes. In other discussions of negligence claims, we're going to get references, of course, to cases and the links to the cases. It even talks about one of the cases we've run across, and obviously the links. So pulling together, as I said, pulling together all of the different areas that we've discussed. So another similar type of resource, if we go back to our list, is cause of action. COA, or the name of the set is causes of action. So we were just looking at proofs of facts. Now we're looking at another very similar one, causes of action. If you can't keep track of the difference between one does than the other, don't worry about it. I usually can't. What I tend to do is I just look at the information screen about that particular title. What you're really, of course, more interested in is, what will this do for me? And again, similar idea. You'll always look through the table of contents, and it's going to give us elements of direct liability. We're not interested in vicarious liability, but if you were, Then it gives us defenses. It gives us a sample case, a sample complaint. So again, it pulls in the forms. It gives us again the basics and the explanation. It'll link us to the primary sources. It now also links us to forms. Again, those checklists, as I just said, be very happy if you see a checklist. We actually see examples of plaintiff's proof, defendant's proof. See what that's all about. So it's talking about the burden of proof, very practical and practice-oriented. I've had a lot of students say to me, I never heard of proof of facts before, and I've gone into it now. It solved such and such problem that they were working on for a particular job. So again, very practice and practically oriented. Has discovery and depositions. So here's a sample of what you might include in a deposition. So I kind of think of proof of facts and causes of action as kind of hybrids, a cross between ALR, because it goes into a little more detail with some good explanation and references, and practice guides and form books, because it pulls it all together. Another type of all-inclusive practice material that we've seen, again, are these loose leaves, which are really just a type of treatise. And we've already been looking at. So I think we actually might have even looked at this. Like this is litigating tort claims, and or tort cases, excuse me. And this used to be a loose leaf that looked like that, and it may still be available in print, but now online as well. And one aspect that may or may not be a good thing that most of these are now used online is that they still, as I mentioned, keep some of the print features. So you still see section numbers. Sometimes you'll see paragraph numbers. A lot of loose leaves back in the print days, plus you used to be organized rather than labeled by section numbers, they were labeled by paragraph numbers. I'm not sure who came up with that idea. But the same strategies apply, just as we were looking at the table of contents within the proof of facts and within the cause of action article itself. We're now looking at the table of contents of this particular treatise. Again, this is really just a repeat of what we talked about with regard to secondary sources and finding a good section and then looking at the table of contents. Main difference now being that instead of highlighting the substance of the explanation, I'm highlighting some of these other features. So again, wonderful checklist, illustrative forms, complaint in denial of care case. Sound useful? Right on point for what we're interested in for our client. ERISA allegations, obviously not all of these would be relevant. Illustrative jury instructions. We talked about jury instructions. And we talked about cases. Okay, so actually we clicked on the link. Another aspect of bringing everything together and practice materials, and this is a new area for all of the services, is they're trying to take advantage of some of the newer technology in bringing these materials together. So here on Westlaw, I'm not sure if you've encountered this, there's Practical Law and Practical Law Connect. So I know a couple of you in your assignments have referenced using the Practical Law filter, which is great. It's just, as I said, another aspect. So here's the practical law filter. What practical law does is what it sounds like. So you can actually see here, again, our liability HMO search, ERISA litigation, preemption of state laws, overview. And what practical law does is, if we could pull it up, again, it gives you the background, links, just some very practice and practical oriented. So this is similar to what we've been looking at. Where it gets a little bit different is up here in Westlaw. If we go to Practical Law Connect, what this does is it pulls together that practical law filter that we were just looking at and pulls in all of the other stuff on Westlaw, because practical law is actually a separate product. So again, depending on where you wind up working, if they subscribe to Westlaw, you may or may not have access to this practical law material. It depends on the subscription. But practical law takes a very problem-oriented approach. So by problem-oriented, we're looking at a particular topic here. So we can do a search, but sometimes it's also worthwhile to try to navigate through, because again, your search terms can pull up irrelevant material, same ideas we've been talking about. So we notice there's actually a topic for ERISA litigation. And then if I can hover my mouse properly, and really just following your nose, so benefit claims, that makes sense. And again, because this is more practice-oriented, I might not, you could start here, because as you can see, it's very explanation, secondary source-oriented, but also, especially as you can see from browsing, you need to know a little bit about the area, so you need to know that group health plans are actually relevant to our client, actually what she has. But now, as you can see, it looks a whole lot different than what we've been looking at in terms of secondary sources. So we've got practical law know-how, forms and standard documents, so help with drafting, links to secondary sources, and then you can browse by content type. So a one-stop shopping resource that's nice to know about, probably more useful, and you can probably use it more effectively if you have a little bit of background in the area first. You don't need to do your full research strategy, but you might want to check out just some basic sources first, and then come look here. Similarly, on Lexis, and let's go actually here on Lexis. If we again go back to our favorite search, we would see secondary materials, some of which some of these practice guides, treatises, maybe even CLE, practice insights might be interesting. So again, these are some of the what we've been thinking about as treatises, but they're really more practice guides. And now that we understand why we might be interested, again, I think we looked at this way back when we talked about secondary sources. Now, of course, this talks about vicarious liability, which we know now doesn't apply to us, but if we look at that ever useful table of contents, we see here, down here, we can go to forms, and again, some explanation that we've talked about before. Okay, again, a more practice-oriented tool on Lexis that actually, I'm not sure you'll have, no, you will have available. You've actually used this already. We're going to take a look at it through Lexis Learn. You used Lexis Learn for some of our makeup materials, so for those of you following along, if you go to Lexis Learn, we're actually going to be through Lexis Learn, we're going to be investigating Practice Advisor. So this again is another tool on Lexis Practice Advisor that you access through the grid up here. So we've taken a look at a couple of these. We've looked at the verdict when we're talking about jury verdicts, and we talked a little bit, so that might be it. So now we'll take a look at Practice Advisor.
Usually included in the subscription, or is it
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, but I believe so. So again, I'm now back in Lexis Learn because I thought that the module here, you did a couple of these to look at Shepard's, but the module here on drafting documents, which is actually looks at transaction advisors. So what I'm going to do here, and I think I finally got the sound to work, is I'm going to walk through. If you want to follow on your laptops, I'd ask that you turn the sound up. Otherwise, we'll have a cacophony of different points, listening to the same video at different points. But we'll walk through this together. Be sort of a mini workshop.
Throughout this module, questions will surface, giving you the chance to review the information covered. Use the legal research system below the video player to answers. In this module, you'll learn the basics of drafting documents in transactional practice areas. Have you ever thought about what you would do if you were asked to draft a stock purchase agreement, a commitment letter, an employment contract, a trademark license, a letter of intent, or a registration statement? You may not know what some of these documents are, but at some point in your legal career, you might be asked to draft one. Transactional drafting gets easier as you build your practice. You'll develop a bank of forms, understand the nuances of specific clauses, and learn questions to ask before you start drafting. Until then, you'll want to do what most new attorneys do. Use practice notes, treatises, and forms to help draft whatever documents you're asked to work on.
Okay, so someone shout out what you think the answer is. Okay, hey, we got it right.
You are interning for the law firm of Tai, Loy & Ho in Honolulu, Hawaii. Your supervising attorney asks you to draft an industrial lease for a warehouse. The warehouse is adjacent to the Tropical Food Company plantation and will be used as a fulfillment center for an online retailer. The leasee, Mr. R.W. Bonds, plans to distribute pineapple-themed merchandise from the warehouse. Because of the uncertain nature of this business, he may want to terminate the lease prior to the end of the term. He has requested the lease include a form of surrender agreement as an exhibit. You've never drafted an industrial lease before and have never heard of a surrender agreement, so you need some practical guidance before you start writing. You access a practical guidance tool. Then, select Real Estate from the Practice Area menu.
Give it your best guess. So we've got business and commercial, family law, intellectual property and technology, or corporate counsel. Okay. Well, this is a more business-oriented type of tool, so not surprisingly, family law is not going to be in there. It's not that important.
There's a task for commercial leasing on the left side of the screen. There is an associated subtask related to drafting commercial lease agreements. Now you have a collection of resources dedicated to the topic. The best place to start for specific questions about an agreement or other document is with practice notes. You'll get the guidance you need to draft and negotiate key provisions of an industrial lease agreement from expert attorneys who practice in this area of law. This practice note points out the important questions of an industrial lease and how an industrial lease is negotiated and executed.
Okay, so you can work through going through Practice Advisor on Lexis. Why it's not going here. It's supposed to let me do that. Anybody going through on your laptop? All right. Almost fails. Anybody finding this? Anybody find anything? All right, let's. What I want it to do is to let me. I'm hoping it'll do is let me go back. Let's see if it's that flexible. So I'm pretty. Usually it botheration. So any thoughts?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I give all of you.
Good guess. Okay.
Now that you have a general understanding of industrial lease agreements, you'll want to go deeper to determine what are permissible uses for the property and what remedies you can include in the agreement in case of a default. As you scroll through the practice note, you'll see a variety of issues related to industrial lease agreements. There is a section covering permitted uses that explains what the provision is and what it should say, depending on which side of the transaction you're representing.
Okay. So basically what we're talking about is looking at these practice notes. Now that's Florida.
thing, I can't find what jurisdiction they selected.
Yeah, you know, I think they changed. That's interesting. They didn't change the video to what they actually have available here. So, and we're in Hawaii. Now, I think the idea, though, is these practice notes give you a sense of the different areas that you need to be worrying about. So it's more than just a form. We went to form books to at least see the format of the form itself, but what this practice advisor is doing is giving us a better sense of what clauses we might need to include in more complex drafting, as well as some explanation. So let's just take another guess here. Anybody got a good guess? We've got tenant's ability to pay, operate its business. So which is an important consideration for permitted uses in an industrial lease agreement.
See.
Not sure that's what I would guess, but tenant's ability to operate business. Again, this is just what we would learn.
You'll also want to check this practice note for a section dealing with remedies. This section discusses the provisions that should be negotiated for default and remedies. It covers what to consider when drafting and negotiating these provisions.
So, anybody want to guess, or I'll just... Don't think so, but... Oh, it is good. Okay.
You've reviewed the practice notes, but want to see what an industrial lease agreement really looks like before you start drafting. Select the forms category and you'll have a variety to choose from. The commercial and industrial lease agreement is a good place to start. You're now looking at a standard industrial lease agreement. As you scroll through the form, you'll notice several open fields. These fields allow you to insert your own information. There are also additional tools to the right of the form, including drafting notes. These notes are written by attorney experts and will help you better understand the nuances of the drafting process for the clauses you may need to include in the agreement you're drafting. Once you've completed the form, you can print or download it using the delivery menu above it.
Oh, let's just guess on that one.
Don't forget, you've also been asked to draft a surrender agreement as an exhibit to the lease. Lexis Practice Advisor leverages the word wheel functionality that suggests relevant terms and phrases as you research. Surrender agreement is a recognized legal phrase, so we know Lexis Practice Advisor will return relevant content. This practice note, written by an attorney expert who practices real estate law, contains a variety of topics to help you draft and negotiate this type of an agreement. The section titled Importance of Releases provides excellent background information covering why you'd want to include a surrender agreement with a lease.
Yeah, I'll just click on. But hopefully you can see, I mean, we're not answering this, trying to get it right, but you can see the use of the
As you
tool.
review the practice note, you'll notice links to helpful forms. Click on the sample Surrender Agreement form. Then you can fill in the open fields of the form and download it to your computer. When you're new to transactional drafting, the best way to learn the ins and outs is to get help from other attorneys who practice in this area. There are many resources available that are written by expert attorneys. Practice notes and annotated forms are particularly helpful. Use them for your drafting assignments, and you'll always have a good understanding of how to get started, even if it's your first time.
Okay, so again, just a quick introduction to what you can do in Practice Advisor, the searchability. You can browse through to your particular area of interest. The fact that it has those practice notes, again, to give you some explanation of what those clauses are and are supposed to do. So I guess we were looking at commercial leasing, as well as the forms and then the drafting notes within the forms. And again, once again, I'm a big fan of checklists. So, and as I said, I believe that will be available if you have Lexis wherever you are working. One other aspect, sort of practical, bringing everything together in one spot aspect that I've referred to a couple of times. Let's just, both on Lexis and Westlaw, tend to be the practice areas. So this is just in regular Lexis, it's not the Practice Advisor. So this will bring together all the different resources we've talked about. So if we were looking at, real estate or real property. Interesting, they have two different names for them. Or you can go, again, jurisdiction specific if you know you have a New York issue, and then within the jurisdiction, likewise, Westlaw has the equivalent. Ooh. Oh no, that's Westlaw Connect. We don't want to go there. The equivalent on practice areas, and we already investigated the practical law. Last thing to want to show you before we take a look at some of these materials with the workshop are some of the other databases, and we talked about in terms of cost-efficient research, going to some of these flat rate databases. And to do that, at least at present, we will go to the Law Library homepage. And again, to look at these databases, you want to go through the Law Library's homepage, because that way you'll get the remote access, the correct remote access proxy link. So the databases will know you're coming from Hofstra. You can search in the blue box, as I've suggested, if you know the name, or you can view our topic list, or you can just go directly to these links. So one of the databases that you may encounter, and as you can see, I now have to authenticate, which is why we need to go through the library homepage. So CCH used to be a publisher that was very well known for publishing these loose leaves. They've now transitioned to online. They still publish them in print, and again, some of you may encounter them in print wherever you wind up practicing. I should mention too, if you do wind up somewhere that has them in print, it's very possible you will be expected to use them in print. Different loose leaves are organized different ways in print. A lot of them, not this one, unfortunately, but a lot of them have a how to use this title tab typically in the first volume. That may help you a lot if you do wind up having to use a loose leaf in print. But as I said, because of all that filing I told you about that has to happen, a lot of organizations are moving to access this material online, as well as the obvious advantages to keyword searching and availability at 2 a.m. when you're in your pajamas at home. Not that you really want to be researching at 2 a.m. in your pajamas, but you get the idea. So CCH covers a whole lot of different areas. The advantage, you will actually find some CCH materials on Westlaw. The advantage to using it in its native format is that it's flat rate. And as I mentioned, a lot of these secondary sources, especially these treatises, can be really expensive on Lexis and Westlaw. So if you do want to find out wherever you're working what other databases you have available. And especially as you specialize, if you do wind up specializing, not everybody does, but if you do specialize, you probably will wind up using these databases more than Lexis or Westlaw. So as I said, CCH has a lot of different areas available. It was mostly known initially for tax, but it has gone into lots of other areas. So I will point out to you there is a food, drug, and devices. That used to be a hardbound loose leaf. We don't get it anymore. I don't even know if it exists in print. You will need that for your assignment. So I wanted to point that out for you. But we will take a look at health compliance just by way of example for this afternoon. And let's see. Let's search. We'll try something a little different. Try not to have any typos, just so you can see what CCH looks like and its navigation. So as I said, the issue with loose leaves going online is that they maintained a lot of the print structure, which can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So what we're seeing here are the explanations. So that's the analysis, why we go to secondary sources, the explanation, as it says right there. So we might want to take, that's where we would get the background. And then again, we have the laws section. So here is the actual text of various state laws having containing my search terms. You see regulations in cases we're familiar with all of this, some news, and then some possible practice type resources. So a smart chart, we have to take a look and see if that was any useful. So here's some agency material. So again, pulling together all of the different primary sources as well as secondary sources that we have talked about. And also, as I mentioned, we'll go back up to the explanation. Let's just click on the first one by way of example. And a lot of people don't like this design of CCH with the screen all divided up. And it is confusing. And again, that's why some people actually prefer some of the loose leaves in print. So actually the second explanation, second example is a better example, because you can see that little symbol, the paragraph number. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but that little symbol is a paragraph number. Again, this is just importing what used to be in print, and it used to get organized by paragraph number. And you'd go to the index, you'd get a reference to a paragraph number, and you just look at the top of the page for the paragraph number and turn it, just like a page number, except a paragraph could last more than one page. Doesn't really mean much online, admittedly, but that's how it's organized. If any of you are very enterprising, you can try when you're doing your assignment to go here to product launch and go here to Cheetah. That's its new interface. CCH has been very slow and very inconsistent about getting all of its material onto the new platform called Cheetah. So that's why I'm not showing you Cheetah exclusively. But if you want to try it, because if you think it makes more sense, go right ahead. It certainly looks a little more modern and cleaner. But again, they don't have everything that's available yet, and it's a little more difficult to figure out. where everything is. So for instance, the food and drug is under life sciences. It took me a while to find that. And maybe just be, I haven't gotten to know this new platform yet, but it takes me a little while to find stuff on it. So you can see here, food, drug, and cosmetics. And as I said, it looks a little cleaner and more modern. Here's some treatises. If that makes more sense to you, then by all means use that. Okay. So that is an example of one flat rate database. We've looked a whole lot at Hein Online. Hein Online doesn't really have press materials. We've looked at it for lots of government materials and, of course, law journals. There are lots and lots of other databases, many of which we actually don't have here. If you practice in the securities area, you might be using something called IntelliGISE, which we don't have access to. And there are a whole lot of other types of these flat rate, very specialized databases that are essentially these all-inclusive, bringing everything together under one database, one title, one area. Any questions? Okay.